Okay, we're going to move on to our second keynote, who is joining us remotely. So, hi, Kyler, how are you? It's really
Hi, great, thank you.
to introduce Kyler Romeo. Kyler is an occupational therapist. I think there's an echo. And pediatric feeding specialist, and serves as Feeding Matters Director of Strategic Initiatives and practices as a NICU feeding specialist at Banner University Medical Center in Tucson. She holds a specialty certification in feeding, eating, and swallowing, and is internationally certified lactation counselor. She works to advance feeding practice by facilitating, I don't know what this stands for, so hopefully you'll help us, Kyler, AOTA's mealtime occupations, a feeding, eating, and swallowing community of practice. She is also a member of the National Perinatal Association's developmental work group for guideline dissemination, also is the founding board member of the Institution of Perception Action Approach, which brings evidence-based education on perception action approach to professionals working with children with movement disorders. So really a wide array of expertise, and we're thrilled that she's able to join us from Tucson. Thank you so much. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. Is everybody able to see my screen this morning?
Yeah, it looks great. Looks great.
Okay, wonderful. I do have a video, an embedded video, so hopefully you all will be able to hear the sound. If not, just let me know. Also, today really is about like a collaborative discussion regarding partnerships and how to harness resources in the surrounding environment through our nonprofit support organization. So if you have questions, feel free to jump in. I will also share my email and information at the end in case anyone wants to carry on this discussion further. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch into our story of a partnership. So I'm going to dive in how 3 different partners came together, how we're working to stay together, and then what successes we have already reaped from this collaboration. I truly believe that collaboration really brings the ability for us to multiply efforts. So I'm hoping that we'll leave today with this kind of renewed motivation to collaborate with people within our own community and through the external community so we can continue to build capacity. So our story is about these 3 organizations. They've aligned under a common cause, which is to bring change to our community, specifically to serving our families that are leaving the neonatal intensive care unit. Each has a unique mission and a contribution to the field, which is to amplify through this collaborative partnership the work that they are doing within their unique sectors. So today I'm going to focus on orienting you to Feeding Matters, but I also want to make sure that you're familiar with Smoothway Home and of course the National Perinatal Association. Just as a quick overview, Smoothway Home works to improve social, developmental, and medical outcomes of very fragile infants. And they do this by enhancing the coordination of care from the unit into the community. They really work to fill the gap of those children that do not qualify for early intervention services, to ensure that families have access to counseling and to care coordination, while the infant has access to a specialist that can visit them in the home to ensure that they're growing and they're thriving. The National Perinatal Association is our nonprofit leader promoting evidence-based practice in perinatal care. So the NPA creates this really inclusive community for collaboration by involving interdisciplinary professionals and elevating the voice of the family and of the child. And so they do this through multiple initiatives with education, advocacy, and also by staying very closely aligned with the research and amplifying the research. Okay, so I'm going to kind of launch into who we are here at Feeding Matters. Feeding Matters is a nonprofit organization. We were founded back in 2006. It was truly a grassroots campaign started by our emeritus board member and our founder, Shannon Goldwater. So she was a mother who struggled with feeding, and her children had pediatric feeding disorder starting from a very young age. So she had triplets who were born at 24 weeks gestation, and all of which had specialized feeding needs. Every child left the unit with a gastrostomy tube. And so her role as a family member and an advocate really brought to the table this group of parents that were struggling to find care and advocacy and support within their community. So Feeding Matters was born out of this grassroots campaign. And we are now the first organization in the world that brings together the healthcare professionals with the parents and the families on equal playing fields to change the system of care for pediatric feeding disorder. Our vision is a world in which children with pediatric feeding disorder thrive. And our mission is to advance pediatric feeding disorder by accelerating identification, which I would argue we are all in the business of identifying children with specialized feeding needs. And we also do this through research and promoting collaborative care. Our mission is accomplished through the actions of our Pediatric Feeding Disorder Alliance. If you look at Feeding Matters, we call ourselves tiny and mighty because we are a team of 6. We are a team of 6 professionals that run an international organization. And it's literally impossible without the power, the talent, and the time of this very rich body of volunteers representing the professional sector and the family advocacy side. So that is really what the Alliance is. They're the people that do the work, whether it's in education or it's research or it's advocacy or it's family support. And so what we have is this very rich environment and diverse environment of people representing all areas of pediatric feeding disorder. And then we often get the question, well, what do you actually do when you're in this game of system change? And so we like to refer back to our theory of change. It's like your quick snapshot or your blueprint of what we want to accomplish. And so this graphical representation really shows you how actions focused on one initiative will impact the outcomes of another. This shows our methodology and it outlines those causal links. So we may be working on one little small aspect here, but what we see is if we're able to accomplish one goal, then it really creates change in another area, which I think is a common theme that we're going to hear throughout the day, that you might be starting a project or initiative here or causing a grassroots change. And then you start to see the rest of the community amplifying this work and just showing exponential gains through that, perhaps that one small seed that you planted. Our long-term goal, though, at Feeding Matters, our long-term outcomes are really captured here in our advocacy agenda. This is a graphical summary of where we believe that we can make an immense impact on the system of care for our children, as well as impacting families' quality of life. So the partnership story today is going to really focus on this aim that we have to have pediatric feeding disorder recognized as a standalone diagnosis. So when our children are leaving the NICU, when our children perhaps are entering care later down the line, maybe they're starting to struggle to eat when they're an older infant, or they are a toddler, or perhaps it's not until elementary school when we start to have perceptual and cognitive impacts for feeding that we see them enter the system of care. So we're going to focus on this first aspect, which is recognition and awareness that pediatric feeding disorder exists right here. Okay, so our original problem and why we embarked on this journey is that we recognize that children with feeding challenges, historically, they have not had a formal diagnosis. And it was the absence of this universally accepted term or a standalone diagnosis that then resulted in poor identification and children not being able to access care. If you just go into community and you kind of listen to how people talk about their children and their eating needs, you may hear terms such as oh, they're just a picky eater, or they're fussy, or they overeat, or parents come up with a wide variety of strategies to help their child grow and thrive, but it can be minimized in the medical community, particularly when we did not have a diagnosis that truly captured the challenges that our families were having. And so as a result, identification is either absent or it's further down the line once that child's difficulties have increased or become more significant. It also results in just inefficient management of the child if we're all using different terms and describing it differently and looking at it from our siloed discipline. Then it's very difficult for our families to make changes and to improve their child's health. It also limits research funding, and then unfortunately we can have impaired health and a long-term disability emerge from something that if we were able to identify it from acute care into transition home, we may not have had this challenge at all. So I'm going to share just a little story from Shannon Goldwater, our founder.
We have taken the triplets to 5 different feeding programs throughout the United States, which has totaled over a year of our lives living in and out of hospitals and away from home. We made great progress at the programs, but ultimately it doesn't matter which program we go to because once home, our children have regressed. Again, it becomes a daily battle to feed them. But as parents, we have to feed our children. We have no other choice. Watching your child suffer several times a day every time they eat is incredibly painful.
Sometimes food makes me sick.
Why don't you like food?
Because they gag.
So that's just one example of what a mealtime looked like in her household. And remember, she is a person that had access to resources. She lives in Phoenix, and so she was connected into a quite advanced system of care. And still, her children were struggling to eat, and that was every mealtime, 6 times a day for 3 children. If you can just imagine the impact on their relationship, on their family's quality of life, and of course, on the children's development. And so that's really why she continued to advocate that we must have a diagnosis so that this isn't the story for other families. All of these challenges really led the parents and the professionals in the field to establish a call to action. They called for this universal standalone diagnosis. And so Feeding Matters answered the call, and we gathered 17 of the world's leading feeding experts across 7 disciplines with caregiver inclusion at the forefront. And they met in March of 2016. And then after several years of consensus meetings, they were successful in defining pediatric feeding disorder. And the consensus definition has since been published in the Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition. This is an open access journal. It's in the January 2019 edition. And they define pediatric feeding disorder as impaired oral intake that's not age appropriate. And it's associated with either medical, nutrition, feeding skill, and or psychosocial dysfunction. At the time of the forming of this diagnosis, it was really important to them, particularly to the families that we referenced, that it was not age appropriate. And that is to capture children that may have other medical challenges, or other diagnoses, such as a child that may have Down syndrome, or a child with autism, a child with palsy, so that they too have eating beyond what was considered traditionally associated with their other medical challenges. Pediatric feeding disorder, the definition really captures the needs of this very heterogeneous population, and it recognizes that this disorder is multi-domain. Most commonly, children enter care through the medical or the feeding skill domain. And what we see is this compounding effect where it starts to impact nutrition and psychosocial functioning. It's really quite complex, and we recognize that optimal care is comprehensive in nature. And then lastly, just to bring you to disorder is, I want to touch on the prevalence with the publication definition. It really sparked new on severity, but to see also the national prevalence study, and this was published in 2021, where pediatric feeding disorder is more common than other well-known childhood disorders such as cerebral palsy or autism. That out of 1 in 37 young children will have pediatric feeding disorder and for the age of 5 and under. So that's quite prevalent. If you look at your typical classroom, you have at least one child, 1 to 2 children, depending on the setting, that would have pediatric feeding disorder. So after the definition was published, then what we did at Feeding Matters is we created a national advocacy campaign, and we realized we have to get a code. If you don't have the right ICD-10 codes, then it's very difficult for you to be able to bill for service. So this is what we did next, and we secured an ICD-10 code. These are the new codes, so in case anyone in the medical community is unfamiliar, these are the codes that we need to be used in practice in order to show the prevalence and direct families towards appropriate care. This is the most specific code in that feeding domain to represent the disorder. Often we see our code still being used for feeding.
Hey, Kyler, I'm going to just interrupt you briefly. We're starting to lose. Let's see if she'll hear me. Hey, Kyler, you're going
can you hear me?
So I wonder if,
Yes.
I think your bandwidth is a little limited at times. Would you mind turning off your video? And that might help. At least we can, might help your audio come through better.
Okay, so I'm going to take myself off camera. Would that help?
Yeah, that may help.
Okay, let's give this a try. Please let me know if you can't hear me though.
We can hear you now.
So really is a full understanding of this partnership journey. Okay, wonderful. So the journey continues, and now what we'll focus on is the next step in prioritization, and which is focusing on this early intervention and treatment. It's well recognized that early identification will access tools that we have available. This is the infant and child feeding questionnaire. This questionnaire is actually quite a robust smart tool that's available online, because it is a smart tool and it adjusts the questions and the content and education based on a family's child's age. But out of the full questionnaire that helps our families identify pediatric feeding disorder and then leads them to the next step of care, we were able to condense it to a quick 6-question screener. So this screener can be given as a professional, it can be taken as a caregiver or a family, and it can be done in partnership. And this screener will identify the difference between typical eating, picky eating, and a child that is at risk of pediatric feeding disorder. So this is for any child that is 5 and younger. You can just start with this questionnaire. I have incorporated the questionnaire into all of my discharge processes in the NICU so that families are oriented to the questionnaire, they understand what the red flags are for pediatric feeding disorder. And if they are attesting to 2 or more of these affirmative responses that are highlighted in orange, they warrant a follow-up outpatient visit or EI visit or specialized care visit that is focused on feeding. Okay, so now that you understand feeding matters, we're going to talk about how those 3 original partners came together in a shared story. Well, Christy Love, Executive Director of the National Perinatal Association, and Vincent Smith, he's an Associate Director of the NICU at Beth Israel. He's also an Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. They came together and launched a multidisciplinary work group, and their aim was to publish guidelines, which had not been done previously. Guidelines for discharge preparation and transition planning for our NICUs to home. So what they recognized is that we really didn't have a guiding document that was comprehensive and addressed the diverse needs of our families, as well as address specific needs that may be related to persons that did not have English as their primary language, persons in the military, people with disabilities, and people from the LGBTQ community. So these guidelines were written through the work of this multidisciplinary work group. And I was invited as a representative of Feeding Matters, but also as a representative from Banner University Medical Center, where I was working as a feeding specialist in a level 3 NICU. The National Perinatal Association brought 22 multidisciplinary experts together. So they really had broad representation. And this also gave us a seat at the table as a nonprofit. And then as a result, we were able to publish the transition preparation and discharge guidelines. This was published in volume 42 of the 2022 Journal of Perinatology. It, again, is an open access resource and can be found on its own landing page called NICUtohome.org, where you have a wide array of resources as well as access to the full publication. And so once it was published, the work group, we moved forward with dissemination. We were sharing it through national conferences and state conferences. And of course, like I said, creating this landing page to share the document. But then the question came up with how do we help support people taking this new evidence or new published guidelines actually into practice? And so that's when we had the idea that we really needed a pilot to take this massive resource and identify some of the key strategies for getting it into practice. And that is how the NICU implementation pilot was born. We came together and decided that we wanted to identify a NICU that could trial the guidelines. And I have to be honest, I was one of the people sitting on this multidisciplinary group, and I fully expected that this implementation pilot would go to one of our large units. We had units that were representing high level at academia, that had multidisciplinary clinics, that had robust resources. And sure enough, they decided not to go with one of the larger entities and instead picked my unit, Banner University Medical Center of Tucson. We are a level 3, 42-bed unit, and we serve Southern Arizona and a multitude of rural communities. And I remember kind of asking, well, why our unit? We do not have the resources, we do not have the infrastructure, and we predominantly are serving families that are either non-insured or underinsured. And their response, the National Perinatal's response was, and that is why we're picking this unit. So we embarked on this new challenge together to see how we could take these guidelines and work them into practice with absolutely no allocated productivity, no time. We had no capacity that was allocated to this project. We had no funding, but what we did have was the support of a few key nonprofit organizations, and honestly, just a will to make some change in our unit. So our next step was to crowdsource. We really needed to know what mattered to the people working in our unit and what mattered to our families in our community. And so I started just with basic crowdsourcing, talking to anyone and everyone that was willing to share their voice. We also went back and looked through some of our response surveys, our quality surveys that we would receive from families. But what we noticed is that we really honestly weren't asking questions that provided us with robust metrics regarding satisfaction. They were pretty surface level. But when we were talking to families one-on-one and other people that we were working with, I wonder if you can kind of guess what was something that bubbled up to the surface as being a key difference maker, an area of contention for our unit. Well, the first area was access to early intervention services. When our children were leaving our unit, they were going off into the community and often had absolutely no follow-up care beyond medical intervention. And the second was the identification of feeding needs and risk factors. It's the most common reason that our families were coming back for being readmitted. Also, it was a major factor in whether or not our infants were being subjected to harm or suffering from shaken baby and non-accidental trauma. And so that led us to picking a few key guidelines from the publication. And as you can see here, we picked guidelines that were focused on early intervention, utilizing our ancillary services, which were our occupational therapists, myself, our physical therapists, and others, the developmental RNs, and then looking at how we were starting the process from initiation of care. So then it became time to plan for the pilot. We had reached a consensus on the specific challenges that we wanted to face, but now we really needed to get into the work and figure out, well, why was this occurring? I next went to my chief and he challenged me. He said, well, you can start a grassroots kind of change campaign, but what would be highly valued is a model, is looking at a systematic model so that we can collect data and really see which initiatives were creating the most change and where were our barriers. What are our barriers to funding, capacity? So to systematically identify the potential solutions and track progress, I dove into research for a model that was, one, going to be open access, and two, was going to be comprehensive and give us the tools that we needed to report to our leadership as well as to our families. And what I found through much research was the dissemination and implementation model of health. The reason I feel that this is a key resource is that it is open access and it is quite robust. So not only does it provide you with tools, but it also provides you with the training modules on how to utilize the tools. And it can be done by one person. It can be done by a provider. It could be done by a researcher, or of course, ideally it would be done with a team. The first phase of implementation was really all about planning. We most commonly overlooked this step in our unit, and it was always tempting to just jump in with both feet. But instead, what we wanted to do is systematically work through this problem so that we could develop the infrastructure that we needed to track and to move forward. Because remember, we had no capacity and no allotted productive time. So what I did first was dove into the implementation project logic model worksheet. I know it's a big mouthful, but this website takes you from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 very systematically. You work through those different phases and are able to fill out the tools. What it did first was help me pick which model. There were hundreds of models, hundreds of D&I project models that are based on the literature and the research. And so what I needed to do is figure out which of all of these models out there was going to be the best fit for us. And so they had a SMART tool that allowed you to pick your specific parameters to help identify the theory, the model, or the framework that you wanted to use for your project. And these were the 5 areas that I picked. You were only allowed to pick up to 5. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens to select from. So this was really a key first step for me, is to bring that model down into something that was doable and could be executed. And so what we were looking at, we valued implementation, organization of our project. We wanted to know what were the barriers and the facilitators. And then we wanted to better understand, how do we transfer our knowledge and define our outcomes? And what this led us to was the active implementation framework, which was one model, as well as the consolidated framework for implementation and research. It's very common that you would use a combination of 2 models to help outline your project. And these are the two models that made the most sense for us. So what the next phase was, is that we pulled in our other 2 partners. So we met weekly with Smoothway Home, and they came in as our support liaison for this project, while we also had oversight from the National Perinatal Association to provide us encouragement and connections to other persons who could contribute. And as a result of ongoing conversation, weekly conversations, we identified these 3 buckets that we wanted to address. We had some process issues. We had some basic discharge process issues with getting people the paperwork they needed, getting reports that they needed, having appropriate evaluations, and then moving that into the next step of care. So that was like our first issue, is just low-hanging fruit of looking at our processes. Then we knew that we wanted to improve our provider relationship with community, education on our side and their side. And then most importantly, we wanted to improve our parents' sense of self-advocacy, their education, so that they could really serve as their child's best advocate. So those were our 3 focus areas. Just a second. Sorry about that. And here is how Smoothway Home came in. So Smoothway Home provided us with a fantastic resource and professional. Her name is Jennifer Harrison, and she came in and said that I will serve as your added capacity. So when we were nearing discharge, we would refer our children to Smoothway Home, this nonprofit organization, and she would connect our families to the next step in care before they ever left the NICU. So she was truly acting as that support coordinator, as our social worker, and as our case manager, all in one for children to get into early intervention. We did not have this capacity. We did not have this professional identified. And by partnering with Smoothway Home, she was able to give us that next step of support. So she was the direct connection to the parent and the family. And then what we did is we have set up, originally it was weekly, but now we're every other week calls with Jennifer. And she tells us from her reporting side how the families are doing, who has accepted a referral to early intervention, and who's accepted referrals to other community organizations. Feeding Matters came in because they are the people that were providing free open access collateral to our families so that we can educate them on the risks of feeding decline once they leave our units. Feeding Matters also came in from a process perspective by helping us use the correct terminology, the diagnostic codes, and our medical team, and being able to identify children with pediatric feeding disorder before they left the unit. And then lastly, Smooth Way Home also is helping from the provider education side, because they offer Wonder Babies, which is the baby's model of education for our professionals in the community to help them understand the needs of our fragile infants. And so as a result, we have been able to get this partnership and the pilot off the ground. Now we have changed our assessment practices, our identification practices, and our pathway of getting children into early intervention. I'm very excited to report that just within the first 3 months of launching the pilot, we increased our referral rate success to early intervention by 200%. And that was just in the first 3 months of care. We also have integrated the pediatric feeding disorder consensus definition into all of our feeding specialty reports. And we are consistently using the ICFQ 6-question screener to identify need. Lastly, we have developed a pathway for families so that once they leave our unit, if they have critical care need related to feeding, that they understand their resources. Feeding Matters has a 24/7 helpline for families that they can call if they're in crisis, and they will receive a call back from a human being within 24 hours of calling. They also have an email network, and they have peer-to-peer support groups and a support person if a family wants that level of care. And so then many people ask, well, what's our next step? We're really just at the beginning of this project. We have realized we very much need funding. And so our next step is that we are starting to submit for large grant funding. And we will see what comes out in the wash from those requests. You know, that's a labor of love too, is looking for grant funding, but that's our next step. And we have also a goal of being able to partner with Define so that we can improve our metric tracking and our quality assurance practices. So that is where we are with this initiation pilot. What I hope you kind of collected is that the pilot was made possible because we utilized the resources that were already available to us within our community through the generous work of these nonprofits. And these nonprofits are available for anyone to utilize the resources, and perhaps it would be a valuable tool for your unit or your projects in the future. So if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to field those questions.
Thank you so much, Kyler. Let's give Kyler a round of applause. That was it was an incredible amount of new information that I actually had never heard before. I don't know if by kind of nodding and shaking, if you all agree. I think there's a tremendous amount of resources that you shared that I didn't know existed. But we do have a few minutes for questions, so let's open it up. I'll get us started. The first is, I thought it was so interesting that when Feeding Matters was initially formed, that the first effort was focused on getting a code, right? Getting that ICD-10 code. And so it's almost like the folks that were there at the beginning thought about sustainability, which people typically think of at the end, right? Because you can imagine that for folks that are struggling with feeding issues with their infant, they're looking for help now. They're trying to figure out what exists now to help me and my family and others in similar situations. And yet there was this forethought about, well, we need a code to make this sustainable. So just curious to know if you know just some of the details about how that thought process started.
Absolutely. It's been a really interesting evolution within the organization. So like I said, it started as a grassroots campaign of families that were looking for support. So in 2006, when Feeding Matters first started, it was called the Popsicle Group. Some people in Arizona still remember when it was a Popsicle Group, and it was families coming together to provide each other support and to basically try to create an avenue of helping their children receive care for these feeding challenges that they were having. But then through the vision of our emeritus board member, she realized that if we really wanted to make change, we needed a system. We need to look at systems change, not change for one family or one institution, but we really had to change the entire system of care. And that's when Feeding Matters actually came into fruition. The first step actually was the definition, because we were still using terms such as failure to thrive or, weight faltering. I'm a therapist, and so our most common ICD was for feeding difficulties, and it was not very specific. So if you looked at the literature, you could do a systematic review of thousands of researchers that were calling this feeding difficulty all at different terms. And so we weren't able to identify the nuances of pediatric feeding disorder. We weren't able to really identify what population it was significant for. And we honestly didn't have robust data to know what was working for what type of child. And that is why we've started with pediatric feeding disorder as the consensus definition. So that was truly the step. The first step was identifying the diagnosis. And once the diagnosis was identified, then we realized we must have the ICD-10. It was all it's a 10, at that time, it was a 10-year model of how we would like to cause change. And so we look at strategic change as being just a continuation of system change, that it's not one action that is going to cause the biggest change, that instead we have to have a multifaceted approach to system change. So when we're talking about the ICD-10, we've actually had quite a bit of feedback from our international community asking, why are you not looking at the international world, and why are you focusing on the United States? And so the way that we try to cause change is, first, we look at it from a regional or a state perspective. That allows us to try different initiatives, that allows us to try success. And once we're able to get success at the regional or the state level, then we move to the national market. Once we can cause change in the national market, then we bring on our international partnerships. And what we have found is that we're able to cause change at a rapid pace versus something that it can cause 10, it can require 10 or 15 years to get a new published definition or to get an ICD. We do not have time to wait for 10 years for change. And so it starts with regional to state, and then it expands to now and international.
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if you can't hear me.
Oh,
were you
yes.
unable to hear me?
We heard most of it. We heard most of it.
Oh my gosh.
We are near. Oh no,
I was
it's
like, I was
fine.
frozen.
Yep. There's still issues with technology. No problem. But we heard most of it. Well, Kyler, we are at the end of time, but we thank you so much for zooming in and sharing your expertise with us. I will certainly be reaching out as, units on our campus are continuing this work around transition of care. And it sounds like you guys are a lot further along in adopting implementation science approaches to putting the NPA practices into place. So thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting with you soon.
You're welcome. Thank you.